May 17th, 1943, 0347 hours. Guadalcanal, the sound was a cough, mechanical and wet, like someone clearing phlegm from a steel throat. A Marine corporal named Vincent Delaney crouched in the mud beneath a banyan tree, his fingers wrapped around the pistol grip of a Thompson submachine gun. Model 1928A1, serial number obscured by rust and jungle rot. The weapon weighed 10 pounds, 45 ounces empty, a burden that had caused more than one officer to question its battlefield utility in the oppressive heat of the South Pacific. In the darkness, fireflies blinked their cold phosphorescence across the tree line. And somewhere in that blackness, Japanese soldiers were moving through the kunai grass with the patience of men who believed they had already won. The Thompson had been laughed at, not by the Americans who carried it, but by the enemy intelligence officers who had captured one intact near Tanaru River 3 months earlier and sent detailed reports back to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Lieutenant Colonel Tadamichi Kurabayashi had written in his assessment, forwarded through channels to the Southern Army Command, that the American submachine gun was an industrial curiosity, wasteful of ammunition, too heavy for jungle warfare, and representative of a nation that substitutes material excess for warrior discipline. The report had circulated among staff officers, who found in it confirmation of what they already believed, that American soldiers, soft from urban comfort, would wilt under the spiritual superiority of the Emperor's forces. They were wrong. Catastrophically, mathematically, irreversibly wrong. Delaney did not know about Kurabayashi's report, but he had heard the laughter. 2 weeks earlier, his platoon had stumbled upon the aftermath of a Japanese ambush that had failed, bodies scattered in a horseshoe formation, the killing ground still marked by ejected brass casings that carpeted the earth like copper seeds. A captured diary, translated by a Nisei interpreter, contained an entry dated April 29th. The Americans waste bullets like children waste rice. One man fires 50, 60 rounds in seconds. It is shameful. It will not save them when we close with the bayonet. The entry ended there, mid-thought, because the soldier who wrote it had died before completing his observation. The mathematics that the Japanese officers failed to grasp were not the mathematics of marksmanship or spiritual fortification. They were the mathematics of industrial output measured in units per hour, of assembly lines that ran 3 shifts without stopping, of a manufacturing capacity so vast that waste itself became a strategic weapon. In 1942, the Auto Ordnance Corporation, Savage Arms, and Colt's Patent Firearms collectively produced 147,000 Thompson submachine guns. In 1943, that number would climb to 285,000 units. Each weapon consumed 16 pounds of steel, 2 pounds of walnut, and 163 separate machined parts. Yet the factories turned them out with the relentless efficiency of men who understood that the war would not be won by the sharpest blade, but by the heaviest hammer. The .45 ACP cartridge that the Thompson fired was itself an expression of industrial absolutism. Each round, a copper-jacketed lead slug weighing 230 grains, propelled by a powder charge that generated 850 feet per second of muzzle velocity, was designed not for elegance but for stopping power. The bullet diameter measured 452 inches, nearly half an inch of blunt trauma that created wound channels described in medical reports as catastrophic and incompatible with continued combat effectiveness. A single Thompson magazine held 20 or 30 rounds, depending on configuration, which meant that a 5-second burst could place 15 to 20 of these sledgehammer projectiles into a target area the size of a doorway. Japanese infantry tactics in the Pacific had been refined over years of combat in China and Manchuria, where massed bayonet charges and nighttime infiltration had broken Chinese defensive lines with brutal consistency. The doctrine emphasized close combat, spiritual discipline, and the willingness to accept casualties in exchange for penetrating enemy positions. Officers trained their men to advance through machine gun fire, to absorb losses, to close the distance where Japanese swords and bayonets would decide the outcome. It was a system built on courage, fanaticism, and the assumption that the enemy would break psychologically before the attackers broke physically. But the Thompson did not care about psychology. It cared about cyclic rate, 600 rounds per minute, 10 rounds per second, a river of lead that turned the air itself into a killing medium. When Japanese soldiers rose from cover to charge, they entered not a duel but an abattoir. The weapon's blowback operation, simple, brutal, requiring no gas system or complicated mechanics, meant it would fire in conditions that would choke a more refined weapon. Mud, sand, salt water, blood. The Thompson swallowed them all and kept firing. Delaney heard the rustle in the kunai grass. A sound like silk dragged across stone. He thumbed the fire selector to full automatic, felt the metal click under his finger, and waited. The doctrine said to wait. The training said to let them close. The Thompson said nothing. Because weapons do not speak, but in the weight of it, in the familiar heft of a machine designed to kill at arm's length, there was a promise that felt almost like comfort. The first shadow materialized at 30 yards, then another, then 5 more. Moving in the practiced crouch of soldiers who had done this 100 times across a dozen islands. They advanced in silence, bayonets fixed, each man a node in a formation designed to overwhelm a defensive position through sheer momentum and the terror of cold steel. In the Japanese Infantry Manual, Section 14, Subsection C, the prescribed tactic for nighttime assault was explicit. Close rapidly to hand-to-hand distance where the spiritual advantage of the imperial soldier negates enemy firepower superiority. It was a sound doctrine, proven in combat based on observable truths about human psychology and the breaking point of conscript armies. But the United States Marine Corps was not a conscript army, and the breaking point they had calculated did not account for what happened when Delaney squeezed the trigger. The Thompson opened up with a sound that was neither crack nor bang, but a sustained roar. A mechanical bellow that seemed to come from the earth itself. The muzzle flash turned night into stuttering daylight. 3-foot tongues of flame that illuminated the scene in snapshots. Advancing soldiers frozen mid-stride. Faces caught between determination and sudden comprehension. The kunai grass bending away from the blast pressure. The .45 slugs tore into flesh at a rate that defied individual counting. 15 rounds in the first second and a half. Each one carrying 500 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. Each one striking with the force of a professional boxer's knockout punch, concentrated into an area smaller than a dime. The leading Japanese soldier, a corporal, judging by the insignia later found on his body, took 4 rounds in a diagonal line across his chest and abdomen before his brain could process what was happening. The wounds were not neat. The .45 ACP, unlike faster rifle rounds, it did not drill clean holes but crushed and tore, creating temporary wound cavities that collapsed organs and snapped blood vessels across volumes of tissue far exceeding the bullet's diameter. He was dead before he hit the ground, his bayonet still locked in the carry position. His final expression captured forever in the rigor of muscles that had not yet understood their owner was gone. Behind him, 3 more men went down in the space between heartbeats. One took a round through the throat that severed his carotid artery and exited through the base of his skull. Another caught 2 slugs in the pelvis that shattered bone and dropped him where he stood. The third simply ceased to exist as a combat-effective unit when a burst walked across his midsection. And what had been a soldier became a casualty in the time it took to exhale. The survivors, and there were survivors, because even the Thompson's withering fire could not kill all of them instantly, broke. Not from cowardice, but from the sudden mathematical realization that they were attempting to charge through a wall of lead that was physically impossible to penetrate. They scattered into the jungle, leaving behind 7 bodies in a loose semicircle around Delaney's position. And in the silence that followed the gunfire, the only sound was the mechanical click-click-click of the bolt locking back on an empty magazine. 20 rounds. 3 seconds of fire. 7 enemy casualties and an unknown number of wounded who crawled away to die in the darkness. It was not marksmanship. Delaney had not aimed in any traditional sense. Had simply pointed the weapon toward the center mass of the assault and let the Thompson's natural tendency to rise and drift do the work of dispersing fire across the target area. It was not heroism, though later he would receive a commendation. It was industrial firepower applied to a tactical problem. And the solution was absolute. In Tokyo, In the offices where staff officers compiled after-action reports and attempted to understand why their soldiers were dying at rates that exceeded all projections. The captured Thompson sat on a table like an artifact from an alien civilization. Colonel Kuribayashi had been replaced. His assessment, quietly shelved after the casualty figures from Guadalcanal, made his conclusions look less like analysis and more like wishful thinking. The new intelligence officer, a major named Takeo Yoshida, who had studied at Stanford before the war and understood American industrial capacity in ways his predecessors did not, wrote a revised assessment that would never be officially acknowledged. The Thompson submachine gun is not a weapon. It is a manufacturing achievement that happens to kill people. We are not fighting soldiers. We are fighting factories. The factories in question occupied 17 square miles of American industrial heartland, scattered across Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. The Savage Arms plant in Utica ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts of workers, many of them women. Since the men were overseas, who fed steel blanks into machines that transformed raw material into receivers, barrels, bolts, and firing pins with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The production line moved with the rhythm of a mechanical heartbeat, one completed Thompson every 12 minutes during peak production, 4,800 units per month from Savage alone. Each one test-fired with a 3-round burst before being packed in Cosmoline and shipped to distribution centers. At the Colt factory in Hartford and Connecticut, engineers had solved the problem of the Thompson's expensive machining requirements by developing simplified production methods that reduced manufacturing time by 40% without sacrificing reliability. The original 1921 model had required 67 hours of skilled machining labor per unit. The 1928A1 reduced that to 43 hours. The M1 variant, introduced in 1942, required only 29 hours and eliminated the bleach lock mechanism that Auto Ordnance's founder had considered essential. The gun got simpler, cheaper, faster to make, and somehow more reliable in the process. The ammunition production dwarfed even these numbers. Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, Western Cartridge Company in Illinois, Remington Arms in multiple locations, the .45 ACP cartridge factories, operated on a scale that defied civilian comprehension, producing rounds measured not in thousands or millions but in billions. In 1943 alone, American manufacturers produced 1.6 billion rounds of .45 ACP ammunition, a number so large that it lost meaning until translated into physical terms. 4 million pounds of lead, 2 million pounds of brass, enough powder to fill 17,055-gallon drums, and enough primers to require their own dedicated production facilities that operated under guard because a single spark in the wrong place could vaporize an entire building. The cartridges moved by rail car to ports, by cargo ship to island depots, by landing craft to beachheads, until eventually a kid from Pittsburgh or Des Moines or Bakersfield would thumb them into a magazine while crouching in mud that smelled of rot and cordite. Sergeant James Basilone, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on Guadalcanal, described the Thompson's effect in a letter to his sister that was never meant for publication, but was found among his effects after his death on Iwo Jima. They come at you screaming, and you don't have time to be scared because the gun is already firing, and then they're not coming anymore. The Tommy gun doesn't ask if you're brave. It just makes the problem go away. The problem, from the Japanese perspective, it was becoming existential. In the jungles of New Guinea, where Australian and American forces pushed northward against determined resistance, captured Japanese documents revealed a growing obsession with the Thompson's tactical impact. A report from the 18th Army, dated August 1943, noted that American forces employ automatic weapons at all levels of organization, resulting in defensive firepower density that renders traditional assault tactics ineffective. Infantry squads equipped with submachine guns can hold positions against forces 3 to 4 times their number. Recommend immediate development of equivalent automatic weapons and revision of infantry doctrine. The recommendation went nowhere because Japan did not have the industrial base to implement it. The Imperial Army's standard submachine gun. The Type 100 entered production in 1942, but by war's end fewer than 30,000 units had been manufactured, a number the Americans exceeded in 3 months of Thompson production alone. Japanese industry, already stretched to breaking by the demands of naval construction and aircraft production, could not simply conjure the machine tools, skilled labor, and raw materials necessary to match American output. The Type 100 was a fine weapon, well-designed and reliable, but it might as well have been imaginary for all the difference it made against an enemy who could afford to issue Thompsons to military police, tank crews, and rear area headquarters staff. On Bougainville, Maois. In November 1943, a platoon of Marines holding a position designated Hill 260 expended 4,700 rounds of .45 ACP ammunition in a single night, repelling 7 separate Japanese attacks. The position was held by 32 men, 14 of whom carried Thompsons. The defensive perimeter measured roughly 80 yards across. Simple division revealed that each Thompson had fired an average of 336 rounds over the course of 9 hours, not sustained fire style, but rather short. Savage bursts whenever shadows moved in the tree line. At dawn, when reinforcements arrived, they counted 112 Japanese bodies in front of the Marine positions, many of them within 10 yards of the fighting holes, close enough that the defenders had smelled the rice wine on their breath. A Japanese lieutenant named Hiroshi Nakamura, captured after being wounded in that engagement, provided testimony to American intelligence officers that was recorded verbatim. "We were told that Americans could not fight at night, that they would panic and their positions would collapse. We were told that our spirit would overcome their machines. But when the firing started, it did not stop. It was not like machine guns that fire in bursts. It was continuous, everywhere at once, and my men were dying faster than they could advance. I ordered retreat after the third attack. My commander said I was a coward, but I had started with 41 men and had 17 left, and none of the American positions had fallen." The industrial logic that made such scenes possible was rooted in decisions made years before the first shot was fired. In 1940, when the United States was still officially neutral and the Thompson was primarily known as a gangster weapon from newsreels about Chicago crime, the War Department had placed its first large-scale order, 20,000 units, a number that seemed excessive at the time. Auto Ordnance, a company that had nearly gone bankrupt during the Depression, suddenly found itself unable to meet demand and license production to Savage Arms. When the order was increased to 50,000 units in early 1941, Savage built an entirely new factory wing, installing machinery purchased from manufacturers who had previously made automotive parts and sewing machines. By December 1941, when the war became America's war and not just Europe's problem, the production infrastructure was already in place and ramping up. The Thompson's reputation as a trench sweeper from the First World War, combined with urgent requests from Britain for weapons to arm its home guard, had created a manufacturing base that could be expanded rather than built from scratch. When the orders came flooding in after Pearl Harbor, 100,000 units, then 200,000, then standing orders for everything the factories could produce, the assembly lines simply added shifts and kept running. The steel came from Gary, Indiana, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where blast furnaces operated around the clock, their flames visible from miles away, turning iron ore into the specific alloys required for gun barrels and receivers. The walnut for the stocks came from lumber mills in Missouri and Arkansas, where entire forests were felled and processed into blanks that were shaped by machines duplicating patterns carved by master craftsmen who would never see the finished weapons. The springs, pins, and small parts came from subcontractors scattered across the industrial Midwest, each one a specialized node in a supply chain that spanned thousands of miles and employed hundreds of thousands of workers who had never fired a gun, but understood that their shift at the lathe or press was somehow connected to boys dying on islands whose names they could not pronounce. It was the mathematics of industrial war, not the mathematics of tactics or strategy, but of unit cost versus unit production, of raw material inputs versus finished goods outputs, of the brutal calculus that said a nation with the capacity to produce one Thompson every 12 minutes would defeat a nation that could produce one every 6 hours, regardless of who had the better soldiers or the stronger warrior spirit. The Japanese had bet their empire on the belief that Americans lacked the will to endure casualties, that soft civilians from a soft nation would sue for peace after a few bloody defeats. They had not considered that those soft civilians included men who could design a factory that stamped out submachine guns the way bakeries stamped out cookies, and that those factories would keep running until the ocean itself ran out of islands to contest. In the dense jungle of New Georgia, in July 1943, a company of Army infantry encountered a Japanese strongpoint built around a reinforced bunker with interlocking fields of fire. The position had held for 3 days against rifle fire and grenades, the machine gun inside cutting down any approach from the obvious avenues. The company commander, Captain Robert Fowler, detailed in his after-action report what happened when two privates with Thompsons worked their way through the undergrowth to within 15 yards of the bunker's firing slit. They fired simultaneously, both weapons on full automatic, approximately 60 rounds combined. The sound was like tearing canvas. When they stopped, there was no return fire. We advanced and found 5 enemy KIA inside the bunker, the walls splattered with blood and tissue. The .45 rounds had ricocheted inside the confined space, turning the interior into what one of my sergeants described as a meat grinder. We took the position without friendly casualties. The image haunted Japanese commanders because it represented a tactical problem with no solution. Bunkers and fortified positions, the backbone of defensive warfare, became death traps when the enemy could pour automatic fire through the openings faster than defenders could return it. A rifle squad might suppress a bunker. A Thompson-equipped fire team could neutralize it. The difference was not courage or training, but volume of fire multiplied by devastating terminal ballistics. And there was no doctrinal response that did not require industrial capacity Japan simply did not possess. By mid-1944, as American forces pushed westward across the Pacific in a grinding campaign of amphibious assaults, the Thompson had become as much a symbol as a weapon. Correspondents wrote about it. Photographers captured Marines silhouetted against tropical sunsets with the distinctive profile of the submachine gun. And the enemy learned to recognize its sound, that mechanical cough, that ripping canvas roar as the signature of impending disaster. On Saipan, Japanese soldiers left desperate messages and captured American equipment. The machine pistols are everywhere. We cannot advance. We cannot defend. We can only die. The note was found in a bunker along with 16 bodies, all of them killed by .45 caliber wounds. The production statistics for 1944 told their own story. 309,000 Thompsons manufactured, 2.1 billion rounds of .45 ACP ammunition produced, 17,000 tons of guns and ammunition shipped to Pacific theater depots. Enough firepower to arm entire divisions with automatic weapons that previous wars would have reserved for specialists and elite units. The logistics were staggering. Ammunition ships dedicated solely to .45 ACP cartridges. Supply depots on islands like Guadalcanal and Espiritu Santo, where warehouses held nothing but wooden crates stenciled with caliber markings and lot numbers. Forward distribution points where a company's supply sergeant could request and receive 5,000 rounds per Thompson-equipped Marine without filling out more than a single form. A captured Japanese colonel, interrogated on Guam after the island's recapture, provided an analysis that American intelligence officers initially dismissed as hyperbole before realizing it was simply accurate. You are not fighting a war. You are conducting an industrial demonstration. Every bullet you fire is a statement that you have more bullets than we have soldiers. Every ship you sink, you replace with 3. Every aircraft we shoot down, you build 5 more. The Thompson gun is not your most dangerous weapon. Your most dangerous weapon is that you can waste Thompson guns on sentries and truck drivers and still have enough for the infantry. We are drowning in your excess. He was correct. By 1945, Thompsons were being issued to categories of personnel that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Cooks, clerks, engineers, anyone whose duties might bring them within range of infiltrators or bonsai charges. The weapon had become so common that training films devoted entire segments to what not to do with it. Don't use it as a club. Don't use the barrel as a pry bar. Don't lean it against trees where it might fall into the mud. The casual abundance spoke to a military that had solved the problem of scarcity so thoroughly that waste itself became operationally insignificant. A footnote in logistics reports that tracked tonnages so vast that individual weapons disappeared into rounding errors. On Peleliu, In September 1944, during some of the most vicious fighting of the Pacific War, a battalion aid station came under attack by Japanese infiltrators who had slipped through the lines under cover of darkness. The medical personnel, doctors, corpsmen, stretcher bearers, had been issued Thompsons as a matter of routine, weapons they had trained with but never expected to fire in anger. When the attack came, 3 Navy corpsmen and 2 Army surgeons held the position with sustained automatic fire while wounded men lay on operating tables behind them. The firefight lasted 8 minutes. 17 Japanese soldiers died in front of the aid station. The corpsmen expended 900 rounds of ammunition. One surgeon, a major from Philadelphia named David Klein, wrote in his journal, "I am a healer, not a killer, but the Thompson does not care about philosophy. I pointed it at the shapes in the darkness and pulled the trigger and they stopped being shapes and became bodies. We saved 32 wounded men that night. The gun saved us." The spiritual dimension that Japanese doctrine emphasized, the warrior spirit, the willingness to die for the emperor, the cultivation of absolute loyalty and fearlessness, met the mechanical dimension of American firepower and found itself quantifiably inferior. It was not that Japanese soldiers lacked courage. Captured diaries and final letters home testified to extraordinary bravery and dedication. It was that courage, unaccompanied by equivalent industrial support, became a suicide pact rather than a war-winning formula. A soldier willing to die charging a machine gun position was admirable in the abstract, but in the concrete reality of the Pacific theater, he was simply a casualty statistic. One more body added to the morning count while American factories stamped out more Thompsons and loaded more ammunition. The Mariana Islands campaign of mid-1944 produced a startling data point that circulated through both American and Japanese intelligence channels on Tinian. A Marine company holding a sector of the defensive perimeter reported expending 14,000 rounds of .45 ACP ammunition in a single night, repelling a series of coordinated attacks. The company numbered 128 men, of whom 39 carried Thompsons. The attacks involved an estimated 800 to 1,000 Japanese soldiers from the 50th Infantry Regiment. Reinforced by naval infantry and tank crews fighting as infantry, by dawn, 473 enemy bodies were counted in front of the Marine positions. American casualties were 11 dead and 27 wounded, almost all from mortar and artillery fire rather than small arms. The exchange ratio was 11-1, killed in action. The ammunition expenditure ratio was approximately 30 rounds per enemy casualty, a figure that appeared wasteful until analyzed in context. The alternative to suppressive automatic fire was close-quarters combat, where casualty rates equalized, where Japanese advantages in bayonet training and willingness to accept losses could negate American firepower. The Thompson's ability to keep the enemy at distance, to create a beaten zone of interlocking fire that made approach suicidal, transformed infantry combat from a contest of wills into a contest of industrial output. And in that contest, Japan had lost before the first trigger was pulled. In the factories back home, production continued to climb. The Savage Plan in Utica expanded again, adding 200,000 square feet of floor space and 900 new workers, mostly women drawn from the surrounding rural communities who learned to operate lathes and milling machines with a proficiency that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. A quality control inspector named Margaret Devlin, interviewed by a local newspaper in 1944, explained the mindset. "Every gun we make is going to save an American boy's life. That's not propaganda, that's just true. So we check every part, every tolerance, every assembly, because somewhere in the jungle there's a Marine who's going to trust his life to the weapon we're building today. You don't cut corners on that." The inspectors rejected components for flaws measured in 10,000ths of an inch. Variances invisible to the naked eye but detectable by precision gauges. Rejected parts went back to be remelted and recast. Nothing was wasted. Even the brass shavings from machining operations were collected, melted down, and returned to the supply chain. The system operated with an efficiency that would have impressed any industrial engineer. Raw materials entered one end of the factory. Finished weapons emerged from the other. And the time between those 2 points decreased monthly as process improvements and worker experience accumulated. By late 1944, the Savage Plant alone was producing 7,000 Thompsons per month. exceeding the combined output of all Axis submachine gun manufacturers. Colt added another 4,000 per month. Auto Ordnance. The original manufacturer contributed 3,000. Smaller contractors and subcontractors added components and subassemblies. The total production for the war would exceed 1.5 million units, a number that became even more staggering when multiplied by the 10 pounds each weapon weighed. 15 million pounds of submachine guns. 7,500 tons enough to fill 9 Liberty ships with nothing but Thompsons. The ammunition production made even these figures seem modest by comparison. By war's end, American industry would produce over 4 billion rounds of .45 ACP ammunition, a mountain of brass and lead that, if stacked in wooden crates, would cover 17 acres to a height of 12 feet. The cartridges moved through the supply chain in quantities that defied individual tracking, shipped by the ton rather than by the round, allocated to theaters in monthly allotments measured in millions, distributed to units in lots of 10,000 or 50,000 rounds at a time. A Marine battalion preparing for an amphibious assault might draw 200,000 rounds of .45 ACP ammunition from the supply depot, load it onto Amtraks and landing craft, and carry it ashore knowing that if they ran out, more was available. Always more. An inexhaustible reserve backed by factories that ran 3 shifts and had standing orders to maximize output regardless of cost. The Japanese understanding of this imbalance evolved slowly, painfully. Through accumulated battlefield defeats and captured documents, a report compiled by the Southern Army staff in Manila, dated January 1945, attempted to quantify the industrial disparity. American submachine gun production exceeds our total small arms production by a factor of 4 to 1. Their ammunition production exceeds ours by a factor we cannot reliably estimate, but believe to be greater than 10 to 1. They are supplying automatic weapons to categories of troops we reserve for riflemen. Their supply wastage, ammunition expended without confirmed kills, exceeds our total ammunition production. We are not fighting an army, we are fighting an economy. The report's author, a colonel whose name was redacted from captured versions, concluded with a recommendation that was simultaneously obvious and impossible. Immediate negotiated peace is the only rational course of action. The recommendation was ignored, because by January 1945, rational courses of action had been foreclosed by decisions made years earlier. And the war would continue until one side or the other lacked the capacity to continue fighting. On Iwo Jima. In February 1945, during the bloodiest fighting of the Pacific War, the Thompson proved its value in the specialized horror of cave warfare. Japanese defenders had honeycombed Mount Suribachi and the island's rocky terrain with tunnels, bunkers, and fighting positions connected by underground passages that allowed troops to move unseen and strike from unexpected directions. Traditional infantry tactics, fire and maneuver, suppression and assault, broke down in the claustrophobic darkness where visibility measured in feet and every corner might conceal a machine gun nest or a soldier with a grenade. Marine flamethrower teams, the specialists tasked with clearing these positions, carried Thompsons as secondary weapons, and the combination became devastatingly effective. The flamethrower forced defenders out of cover. The Thompson killed them as they emerged. A corporal named Anthony Stein, who would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on Iwo Jima, described the technique in a letter written after the battle. You burn them out and shoot them down, and it's not heroic, it's not clean, it's just what works. The Tommy gun is perfect for it because you don't have time to aim. They come out of the smoke and fire and you just hose them down. I went through 11 magazines in one afternoon clearing a ridge. That's 330 rounds. I know I hit maybe 40, 50 Japs. The rest of the bullets went into rock and sand and air, but that's okay, because we've got plenty of bullets and not enough Marines. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with deeper reserves, and by 1945 those reserves existed only on one side of the conflict, Japan's industrial base. Never comparable to America's even at the war's beginning, had been systematically destroyed by strategic bombing and naval blockade. The factories that might have produced submachine guns were making bamboo spears for the homeland defense. The ammunition plants that might have fed those guns were producing fewer rounds per month than American factories produced per day. The supply chains that might have delivered weapons to the front lines were interdicted by submarines and aircraft that operated with impunity because Japan no longer had the fuel or pilots to contest them. A Japanese private named Kenzo Okuda, captured on Okinawa in May 1945, provided testimony that American interrogators found almost pathetic in its honesty. "We had 47 rounds per man when the Americans landed. 47 rounds for a battle we knew would last weeks. The officers told us to make every shot count, to wait until we could see the enemy clearly before firing. But the Americans didn't wait. They fired constantly, thousands and thousands of rounds, and we could not return fire without exposing our positions and wasting our limited ammunition. So we waited in our holes and they killed us with flamethrowers and demolition charges. And when we tried to counterattack at night, they shot us down with automatic weapons that never seemed to run out of bullets. I surrendered because I had 3 rounds left and no food and no hope." The hopelessness was not melodramatic but actuarial, a mathematical certainty derived from production figures and casualty rates. The United States could afford to lose Thompsons to rust, to accidental drops into the ocean, to careless handling that damaged them beyond repair, because replacement weapons arrived faster than attrition could deplete them. Japan could not afford to lose anything, and was losing everything anyway. The inevitable outcome when industrial capacity becomes the determining variable in industrial warfare. The final accounting, compiled after the war by military historians and logistics analysts, revealed the full scope of the disparity. American forces had fired approximately 3.8 billion rounds of .45 ACP ammunition during the Pacific War, an average of 211 million rounds per month over 18 months of intense combat. Japanese forces had captured approximately 4,700 Thompson submachine guns during the entire war, weapons taken from overrun positions, crashed aircraft, and sunken ships, and had so little ammunition for them that most were relegated to ceremonial display or guard duty rather than combat use. The captured Thompsons became symbols of what Japan was fighting against, an industrial juggernaut that could afford to lose thousands of advanced weapons and still overwhelm defenders with sheer material abundance. In the ruins of Tokyo, in the offices where Imperial General Headquarters had once planned operations spanning oceans, American occupation troops found filing cabinets filled with intelligence reports on Allied weapons. The Thompson appeared in dozens of documents, its specifications analyzed, its tactical employment studied, its industrial production figures cited with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. One report, dated April 1945 and apparently never filed or distributed, contained a single handwritten note in the margin. "We understood their weapons. We did not understand their factories. That was our mistake." The mistake had cost Japan approximately 2.3 million military dead, an empire reduced to rubble, and a worldview shattered by the revelation that spiritual fortitude could not overcome metallurgical capacity. The Thompson had not won the Pacific War. Wars are not won by individual weapons, but by integrated systems of production, logistics, and application of force. But it demonstrated with brutal clarity that industrial mathematics trumped warrior ethos when both met on the battlefield. The .45 caliber slugs that tore apart jungle ambushes were not just bullets, but statements of industrial philosophy. We have more. We can make more. And we will continue to have more until you have nothing. Corporal Vincent Delaney survived the war and returned to Philadelphia, where he worked in a machine shop until his retirement in 1978. He never spoke much about Guadalcanal or the Thompson, or the night he killed 7 men in 3 seconds. But in his garage, wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in a footlocker he had brought home from the Pacific, was a Thompson submachine gun he had somehow kept despite regulations requiring their return. The serial number had been filed off, probably during the war, probably by Delaney himself, when asked about it once, years later, by a grandson who found it while looking for fishing gear. Delaney said only, "That gun saved my life more times than I can count. I figured I owed it a retirement too." The weapon that had been laughed at by Japanese intelligence officers in 1942, dismissed as wasteful and symptomatic of American industrial excess, had become by 1945 an object of near mythical status among the men who had carried it. Not because it was elegant, it was not. Not because it was efficient, by most measures it was extraordinarily inefficient, consuming ammunition at prodigious rates and requiring constant maintenance in tropical conditions. But because when courage met firepower, when discipline met industrial capacity, when the mathematics of warrior spirit collided with the mathematics of mass production, the Thompson and the system that produced it had proven categorically superior. The factories fell silent after the war, the assembly lines stopped, the three-shift operations reduced to single-shift maintenance as contracts were canceled and orders redirected toward peacetime production. The machinery that had stamped out receivers and machined barrels was retooled to make typewriters, sewing machines, and industrial equipment. The workers who had built Thompsons went back to building cars and appliances and the thousand mundane products of civilian life. The warehouses full of 45 ACP ammunition were eventually emptied, the cartridges sold as surplus or scrapped for their brass and lead. The system that had produced 1.5 million submachine guns and 4 billion bullets dissolved back into the peacetime economy as though it had never existed. But it had existed. In the jungles and caves and coral reefs of the Pacific, in the hands of boys from farms and cities who learned to trust the weight and roar of a weapon that never asked if they were brave but simply made the problem go away. The Thompson had written its own history in brass casings and empty magazines. Not a history of glory, there was no glory in industrial slaughter, but a history of mathematical inevitability, of the brutal equation that said production capacity times firepower density equals victory. Regardless of courage, regardless of spirit, regardless of how many times the enemy laughed before they understood what was coming. In the darkness beneath the banyan tree. In May 1943, Vincent Delaney had not known any of this. He had known only that the Thompson was heavy, that it kicked like a mule, that it went through magazines faster than seemed possible, and that when he pulled the trigger, men who wanted to kill him stopped advancing. That was enough. That had always been enough. The rest, the factories, the statistics, the industrial triumph, was context for historians, for the men who carried the weapon. The only mathematics that mattered were simple. They had bullets. The enemy did not have enough, and the war would continue until one side ran out. The sound was a cough, mechanical and wet, like someone clearing phlegm from a steel throat. It was the sound of American industry applied to the problem of killing. And it echoed across the Pacific until the enemy had no more ambushes left to laugh about.